Hello there. I recently watched the movie Fitzcarraldo. I don't really want to talk about that movie in particular, but whenever I watch a historical movie, I always make a point of doing like some basic like Wikipedia research about the subject matter, the surrounding area. So Fitzcarraldo is sort of loosely based on a real person. In the movie, it's like an opera enthusiast who decides that in order to fund an opera house out in the jungle, he's going to become a rubber baron. And in order to do this, he decides to drag a boat over a mountain to get to this unexploited section of river that isn't normally accessible. So the real Fitzcarraldo wasn't some sort of luckless wannabe rubber baron. The real Fitzcarraldo was a extremely successful rubber baron who did sort of drag a disassembled boat over a mountain to get to this unexploited section of river. But the other thing about the real world Fitzcarraldo was that he was a slaver and a genocider. See, the rubber barons, back in the day, they were faced with the same sort of problem that all of these colonists are, namely the Indian problem. Namely that there were already people here who weren't necessarily going to be very happy about you coming in and stealing all their stuff. The rubber barons also had another problem in that they needed labor. And if you get people from, I don't know, the city to come out and be your laborers, you have to pay them. And paying your employees, well, that's just not good business. Not the best way to maximize shareholder value. So the real world Fitzcarraldo's approach, and this was not at all unusual for the rubber barons, was that he'd go into the region he wants to exploit, place with a lot of rubber trees. He'd identify the local indigenous group, and then he'd try and identify a neighboring indigenous group who maybe didn't get along with Group A quite so well. He'd then go to Group B and say, hey, I hear Group A is planning some trouble, but I'm your friend and I've got all these shotguns just lying around, so tell you what, here's a deal. For every slave that you capture from me, I will give you 1 shotgun. And by the way, here's a 5 shotgun starting bonus. He'd then go back to Group A and he'd say, hey, Group B's got a load of shotguns now and they're coming to start some trouble against you. But I'm your best friend, so I'll make you a deal. For every slave that you give me, I'll give you 1 shotgun. And here's a 4 shotgun starting bonus. This sort of immediately escalates the tensions to the maximum level. Let's say that Group A and Group B, they've got some sort of standard feud. Somebody slept with some guy's wife or whatever. That sort of tension might well involve sort of lethality. People might get killed over that. But the stakes are ultimately very low. There's the potential for compromise, for forgiveness. Some guy from Village B sleeping with some guy's wife from Village A is not an existential threat for both of those villages. But by introducing this buying slaves for shotguns, suddenly this conflict is escalated to the maximum level overnight, basically. So these 2 villages would fight it out, and Fitzcarraldo would reap the benefits in terms of lots and lots of slave labor. Eventually, one of the 2 villages would be exterminated entirely, and the surviving village would be reduced in population dramatically, at which point they would be in no position to resist the rubber barons' advances into the region. If they were allowed to exist, they were allowed to exist solely at the mercy of these slavers, really. Often they weren't allowed to exist. The surviving village would just be immediately laid siege to by a bunch of goons with shotguns under the employ of the rubber barons. The survivors would all be taken in as slaves. I forget the numbers, but it was something absurd, like more than 3/4 of all of the the peoples, the nationalities, the groups of peoples who existed in the Amazon prior to the rubber barons, they were annihilated by this practice of slave raiding and inciting feuds and escalating feuds. The rubber barons annihilated something like 3/4 of all indigenous groups in the Amazon. And this occurred up until the 1910s. This only stopped occurring when the bottom fell out of the rubber market because they found rubber trees, or they imported rubber tree seeds to like Indonesia or something. This was occurring after the relevant countries had outlawed slavery. So like Peru, Brazil, they'd outlawed slavery tens, dozens, 50 years earlier, but they were still using indigenous slaves in 1913. And I didn't know any of this. I'd never heard of any of this. I found it very sort of upsetting to read about, but I also found it sort of upsetting that I'd never heard of any of this. And that's sort of all I have to say on this subject. Thank you for listening.